play it any louder, then it's getting shut down.
My name is Waffles, and I'm a government whistleblower turned political commentator, and this is the last 24 hours in the news. Today is November 26, 2025. It is 10:52 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. Here are the top U.S. news highlights for the past 24 hours. Appeals court blocks administration plan to expand rapid expedited deportations. A federal appeals court refused to greenlight the administration's expansion of expedited deportation authority for non-border migrants, leaving in place lower court due process protections. This is a judicial check which limits a major enforcement priority. Expect emergency appeals and possible shadow docket filings. This will be a near-term legal test of the administration's statutory claims. Things to keep an eye on if you'd like to follow this story: appeal it briefs and any emergency stay to the Supreme Court, interviews with immigration law clinics about field impacts. CDC public health web content was altered in ways critics say echo anti-vaccine claims. Changes to the CDC vaccine safety language prompted public criticism from scientists and medical groups. Politically driven edits to core public health guidance risk undermining vaccine confidence, raising concrete health and civil rights harms, school exclusions, and parental decisions to be included in that. Things to keep an eye on: archive page snapshots, CDC HHS change logs, and any FOIA trails showing who authorized the edit. Federal courts continue to constrain domestic deployments of federal and federalized forces. Judges have blocked or curtailed elements of the D.C. and other deployments, with stays and appeals pending. Courts remain the principal institutional brake on ad hoc federalized policing or troop use within U.S. cities. Legal filings will reveal the administration's claimed authority and rules of engagement. Things to keep an eye on: the district court orders and the administration's appeal it justification for domestic troop use. Bomb threats against multiple Democratic lawmakers tied temporarily to inflammatory presidential social media posts. Several congressional offices received bomb threats after a series of highly charged posts from Donald Trump and allied accounts. FBI and Capitol Police are investigating. This is a direct public safety consequence tied to political rhetoric. It elevates the risk of politically motivated violence and requires transparent threat attribution from law enforcement. Things to keep an eye on: FBI and Capitol Police situation reports, platform moderation logs, and any criminal complaint filings. Large public protests, counter mobilizations, and local law enforcement activations continue. Demonstrations, including organized remove the regime style actions, prompted police mobilizations in several cities. Some events drew counter protesters and higher security postures. Where rhetoric, mobilization, and weekly coordinated policing intersect, risk of escalation and unlawful use of force grows. Local governments have been primary responders. Federal involvement remains litigated. Mobilizations of police or military inside the United States borders, explicit National Guard federal force deployments remain contested. Recent court orders curtailed some D.C. deployments, and a few state-level challenges, e.g. Tennessee, are active. These deployments, whether by state governors, federalizes forces, or ad hoc federal units, continue to be a major civil liberties and public safety story. Local police mobilizations, law enforcement agencies have been activating resources around threats, protests, and high-profile political events. Those are being handled at the state and local level with federal support for threat investigations. House GOP moves to centralize and push federal AI preemption, reported as active interest. Federal preemption of state AI rules would concentrate regulatory power in Washington and could remove localized consumer protections or worker safeguards. Things to keep an eye on: draft bill language and whether it is attached to must-pass legislation. Institutional strain from staffing cuts and reorganization. Why it matters: analysts warn agency staffing reductions are degrading service delivery and regulatory enforcement. Risk to benefits, safety inspections, and emergency responsiveness. Things to keep an eye on: specific agency staffing memos, OMB, GAO audits, and any fast-track rulemaking that reduces oversight. SNAP and other benefit changes remain in litigation. Administrative changes to social safety net programs, such as SNAP, face lawsuits alleging statutory overreach. Outcomes directly affect food security for low-income households. Internet CDN outage fragility persists. Vendor configuration errors, notably a major CDN provider's postmortem shows single point failures can knock down transit sites, news outlets, and municipal pages, a systemic resilience concern. Why it matters: interruptions to transit information, emergency updates, and public service portals are public safety risks. Power grid winter vulnerability flagged. Regulators and grid monitors warn of elevated winter outage risk. Regional New England, Texas, and Southeast due to weather and demand pressures. Why it matters: extended outages endanger heating-dependent households, medical facilities, and water systems. Keep an eye on utility winter readiness briefs, state emergency plans, and hospital contingency logs. Respiratory viruses remain elevated. CDC dashboard: COVID, influenza, and RSV activity are active in multiple states. Hospitalization risk exists for vulnerable populations. Combined with politicized messaging, elevated respiratory activity increases hospitalization risk and strains health systems. CDC regional hospitalization data is something to keep an eye on. Local public health advisories and school exclusion policies for more information. Politicization risk in public health guidance. CDC website edits, reported editorial changes to CDC pages prompted rapid scientific pushback. Why it matters: eroding trust in public guidance, reduces vaccine uptake, and weakens outbreak response. In international relations regarding the U.S. diplomacy on Ukraine contentious peace plan push in Geneva. A U.S.-backed 28-point plan provoked resistance from Kiev and some European allies. Reports indicate the draft included concessions Kiev rejected. U.S. diplomatic moves that pressure partners to accept terms they view as harmful could undermine allied cohesion and have long-term geopolitical consequences. G20, COP, and multilateral fissures. U.S. absence or limited engagement at major forums. G20, COP30 dynamics is altering how global climate and trade governance is negotiated. Corporate actors often fill policy gaps. So the United States is not present at the G20? Trying to figure that out. The United States boycotted the recent G20 summit in South Africa, and a U.S. official was not present to receive the G20 presidency gavel. The G20 is a separate forum from the G10. I accidentally typed in G10. G20 Group of 20 is a forum for the world's top economies and held as a summit in South Africa. So he's bullying all the countries in the world with his fucking tariffs and is not attending the Global Economic Summit this year. That is the G20, where all of the world's economies are gathering together to have economic discussions on how to have an efficient economy. Donald Trump is not there. The United States is not participating. Africa is a place of interest for global economic development. He should be there. Boycotting it, this whole thing about colored people being the problem, I don't think that's the issue. No, I think BRICS is behind this. I think that what we're dealing with is economic espionage. The United States would have an interest in Africa. The color of the people in Africa is not the issue, and I don't think that the color of the people in Africa is the issue for Donald Trump either. I think that Donald Trump is colluding with Russia and BRICS, the economic cooperation, to destroy the United States economically, and I think that is why the United States is not at the G20. I think that is why Donald Trump and this whole hating of people in Africa thing is going on. I don't think it has anything to do with the color of the skin of the people in Africa. I think it's an excuse to not take interest in the economic activity in Africa because BRICS wants the money. I'm just saying. Legal action specifically against Donald Trump. Active federal and state litigation continues. Criminal indictments, civil suits, appeals, and Supreme Court filings remain active. No case-ending ruling in the last 24 hours, but dockets and appeals are moving. Monitoring of briefs and emergency filings is essential. Administration-level countersuits and legal maneuvers are ongoing. Courts have limited some administration moves, e.g. deportation expansion, showing mixed outcomes in litigation battles. Bomb threats spiked, tied to presidential rhetoric, immediate violent threat outcomes that law enforcement is treating seriously. This is a shock to public safety. Investigative reporting, forceful operations proceeding despite legal concerns. Investigations published in recent days in regards to senior officials moving forward with forceful operations despite internal council objections, a red flag for oversight and potential unlawful action. I believe that's in regards to the killing of people in boats, the fishermen near Venezuela. Highest immediate threats to the people, politically motivated threats and protest escalation, public health miscommunication, infrastructure, internet plus grid failures during winter or mass events. That is what is being flagged today. Institutional controls. Federal courts remain a crucial check on the administration's domestic security and deportation strategies. Congressional oversight and agency FOIA trails are central to accountability. What to watch in the next 48 hours: appellate briefs on deportation and guard deployment cases, FBI and Capitol Police threat reports, CDC archived page change logs, retail durable goods data releases, delayed series, and any emergency Supreme Court shadow docket decisions. Pentagon urged adding Alibaba, Baidu, and BYD to China military entity list, reported today. Why it matters, it formalize the designation, which would widen export controls. Reputational pressure on some of China's largest firms with knock-on effects for U.S. partners, supply chains, and bilateral trade. Words I can't pronounce. Détente. It's a high-leverage national security move that could accelerate economic decoupling. For more information on this, you can get the Feinberg letter to Congress, ask the DOD or Commerce for the legal basis and any risk assessment, map U.S. companies with contractual links to those firms. Venture Global accuses Shell of a 3-year campaign to damage its LNG business, reported today. Litigation and corporate warfare. The LNG market can affect European energy security and U.S. export strategy. This dispute could trigger contract renegotiations, arbitration appeals, and geopolitical ripple effects for energy-dependent allies. U.S. advocacy group sues Apple over alleged use of Congo conflict materials. A successful suit could force supply chain transparency and change sourcing for a major U.S. tech company with human rights and investor risk consequences. It's a direct test of corporate due diligence claims versus field realities in conflict conflict zones. For more information, get the complaint supplier lists cited and the University of Nottingham study the suit. References Apple for supplier audit logs and third-party audit reports. Appeals court reaffirmed block on expanding expedited removal deportations. This is a key judicial limit on major administration enforcement tactic. Expected emergency appeals and shadow docket activity that will reveal administration's statutory theory and operational plans. Bomb threats to Democratic lawmakers after Donald Trump was literally calling for Democratic politicians to be hanged. CDC vaccine safety page, we already went over that. Cloudflare, we already went over that. That's the infrastructure issue that was going on with the internet and services and interruptions to transportation and emergency communications. That was a vendor that failed on a mass scale. Next period, chip and export controls and ongoing auto supply pain. Supply shock still rippling. Recent reporting last few days with continued overnight industry noise. Semiconductor export restrictions and supplier bottlenecks continue to disrupt auto production lines, a manufacturing and labor market risk that can ripple into layoffs and regional economic stress. Mixed trade and security signals, reports of U.S.-China purchase commitments while Pentagon readies a stricter list. The United States is still trying to negotiate to get soybeans purchased by China while also intending to add more restrictions on trade with China. Just cover that in my international news coverage. This will conclude our 24 hours news update for the United States. I'm going to move on and go do this economic report now. Bye-bye. My name is Waffles, and I'm a government whistleblower turned political commentator, and this is the last 24 hours in the news. Here are the top U.S. news highlights for the past 24 hours. Today is November 24, 2025. It is 8:10 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. Appeals court keeps block on administration's plan to expand fast-track deportations. A U.S. federal appeals court declined to allow the administration to expand an expedited deportation process to migrants living far from the border, upholding lower court due process concerns. This is a judicial constraint on a core enforcement priority. Accountability note, expect emergency appeals and briefing papers, obtain the appellate opinion, and any stay motions to see the administration's legal theory. CDC website language altered to reflect Health Secretary RFK Jr.'s view on vaccines and autism. The CDC changed vaccine safety language in a way critics say undermines decades of scientific consensus that vaccines do not cause autism. Scientists and public health groups sharply criticized the move. This poses public health and civil rights risks, misinformation affecting parental choice and children's access to safe schools. Archive the prior page way back if you'd like more information. So go to the Wayback Machine. It's like it shows you like old information on the internet. Request the agency changelog and FOIA communications from HHS Secretary's office if you would like more information on this or if you would like to report on this. Federal court rulings continue to check domestic troop deployments. D.C. National Guard order. A federal judge found aspects of the D.C. Guard deployment unlawful and ordered an end. Implementation stayed for appeal. That ruling is part of an active litigation thread limiting federalized domestic troop use. If you would like more information on this, monitor appeals briefs that will contain the administration's claimed statutory and constitutional authority for using Guard forces inside cities. Bomb threats against multiple Democratic lawmakers after Donald Trump made posts accusing them of seditious behavior. Several lawmakers targeted by inflammatory presidential posts received bomb threats to offices or homes. Law enforcement investigated each call. This is an acute public safety issue tied to political rhetoric. For more information on this, seek FBI, Capitol Police situational reports and timelines linking social platform posts to threats. Document any intelligence attribution. National Guard federal force deployments remain contested and partially enjoined. See the D.C. order November 20th. And related litigation in Portland and Chicago. Judges have curtailed deployments as exceeding statutory authority. Appeals stays are active. This remains the central domestic mobilization story. Local law enforcement mobilized around protests and targeted threats, bomb threats, and responses. These are active, localized deployments by police and are being handled by state and local agencies and the FBI. Legal limits are reshaping the administration's enforcement playbook. Court setbacks on rapid deportation expansion and domestic deployments reduce executive operational scope and push policy fights into appellate and possibly Supreme Court channels. CDC language change signals political influence on technical agencies, a governance risk that can degrade institutional capacity and citizen well-being. Things to keep an eye on: regulatory and staffing changes across agencies. Recent policy analysis show workforce and institutional capacity strains. These can translate into delayed benefits, enforcement gaps, and reduced emergency responsiveness. Critical infrastructure fragility, major outages, and vendor failures. Recent technical post-mortems and industry coverage continue to show how single vendor configuration errors, major CDN and edge providers, can cascade into mass service outages that disrupt transit and public information. This is an infrastructure resilience risk for public safety. Grid and winter power risk flagged by utilities and monitors. Industry analysts warn of increased winter outage risk in parts of the U.S. Counties reliant on backup power and hospitals should confirm contingency plans. CDC surveillance respiratory viruses remain elevated. CDC dashboard update November 21st, 2025. Hospitalization and RSV, flu, and COVID activity are present in multiple states. Vaccination messaging is critical going into winter. Politicization of public health messaging. CDC website edits. The recent website changes November 20th and 21st are prompting scientific pushback and risk undermining vaccine uptake and trust in public guidance. This is an actionable public health risk. U.S. diplomatic pressure on Ukraine peace proposal. Intense reactions from Kiev and allies. U.S.-backed draft plan in Geneva has provoked resistance in Kiev and among European partners. Diplomatic fallout could affect security assistance and allied cohesion. This is a major foreign policy accountability story. COP30, climate diplomacy, disruptions, and summit fragility. Fire at COP30 pavilion and contentious negotiating outcomes. Recent reporting: these diplomatic flares matter for U.S. climate leadership and finance commitments. You know, I'm just remembering how Jesse Waters, when the UN was in session here just, last month, was saying that the United Nations should be bombed. He was essentially endorsing political violence towards the United Nations while it was in session. I'm just wondering if the COP30 stuff that's going on is possibly related to any of that, if it's an act of terrorism. I don't know. I'm just speculating. Active litigation continues. Criminal and civil matters, appeals, and Supreme Court docket activity are ongoing. There were no final case-ending rulings in the last 24 hours, but filings and appellate activity continue. Tracker updates November 21st to 23rd. Expect more appeals and briefs. Bomb threats following presidential posts, lewd and concerning behavior. These are immediate violent threat outcomes tied to presidential rhetoric. November 22nd reporting that is a shock public safety event driven by political speech. Administration proceeding with forceful operations despite council concerns. Recent investigative pieces report that forceful overseas and domestic operations, this would be bombing the fishermen in the Gulf of Mexico, or near the Gulf of Mexico, near Venezuela, bombing fishermen, bombing people in boats who are catching fish, to take care of their families and feed themselves. Recent investigative pieces report that forceful overseas and domestic operations have at times proceeded over legal objections, an oversight and accountability emergency, if true. Ongoing reporting documents repeated lewd and derogatory presidential rhetoric, which has downstream effects, normalizing abuse, inciting threats. Recent threats to lawmakers highlighting the public safety consequences of such language. Things to keep an eye on. Pull the full appellate opinion on the deportation expansion on and any emergency filings to SCOTUS. Request FBI, Capitol Police timelines and threat assessment for the bomb threats. FOIA if needed. Archive CDC page using the Wayback Machine online. And FOIA at the HHS CDC change logs and communications approving the edits. Download the district court order Judge Gia Cobb on DC Guard deployment and the administration's appeal filing. Those are things to keep an eye on if you're reporting. Track Supreme Court shadow docket activity for emergency stays that could change on short notice. Additional things in the last 24 hours of the news. Appeals court refuses to greenlight expansion of fast-track deportations. A federal appeals court on November 22nd declined to allow the administration to expand fast-track deportations to migrants living far from the border. This is a near-term judicial break on a core enforcement priority. It preserves procedural protections and will trigger emergency appeals, possible shadow docket activity. Watch for the administration's legal theory in appellate briefs. Those briefs will show how far executive enforcement will push statutory limits. Immediate follow-ups: obtain the full appellate opinion on any emergency stay motion to SCOTUS or request interviews with immigrant rights organizations for immediate field impact. Multiple bomb threats to Democratic lawmakers following Donald Trump's bullshit on Truth Social.
So the Olympics is great, and Johnny for the others, the World Cup, Johnny is the head of it. We had our top people, Wasserman. They all came in on the Olympics, and then I saw Johnny. And we got the World Cup, too. And, it's only because they rigged the election that I'll be your president representing you there. I got both of them. I got the Olympics, and I got the World Cup. And I said, it's too bad. One was in 2026, and the other was in 2028. And I said, I won't be there. I won't be your president. But then they rigged the election, and now we won, so I'm going to be your president for the Olympics and for the World Cup. So, Johnny, thank you for the World Cup, and everybody, thank you for the Olympics. We're going to have a great time.
Hey guys, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and comment on my videos. And also, don't forget to check out my shop where you could get this awesome Real Patriots Punch Nazis t-shirt. America, fuck yeah! And if you go to the link tree in my bio on most platforms, it's got links to everything, all of my stuff. You can find my shop there. I'm on eBay. You can also get this cool Exterminate MAGA sticker, because MAGA's fucking cockroaches. And fuck MAGA. Abolish MAGA. Fuck you, MAGA.